and Europeans to genetically modified crops to appreciate this. I lived in the US for 23 years, up until about 8 years ago, blissfully unaware even that I was consuming genetically modified crops, and like most Americans, unconcerned about it. So it was quite surprising to discover that Europeans were very uncomfortable about this. And indeed, most Americans regarded Europeans' responses as irrational at worst, and at best, a sneaky way of putting into place constraints on international trade in agricultural products. That's how they made sense of European opposition. But actually, it seems to me that what underlies this difference is a fundamentally different sense of the relationship between people and nature across the Atlantic. I, by the way, am a dual national. I hold both passports. So I have a foot sort of in both camps. But when I talk to my fellow Americans about nature, what they usually come back at me with is the idea of the wilderness. Pristine nature where humans have not set foot. At least the national parks. Nature is where people are not for Americans. On the other hand, Americans have no illusion about the industrial scale of agriculture. And indeed, many of you may have flown across the great prairies of the United States and seen these huge circular outdoor machines that make soybeans out of sunlight and water, the central pivot irrigation fields. Contrast that a moment with the experience in Europe, and certainly at least in Northern Europe, in Britain. If I ask people, tell me what comes into your head when I say the word nature. In Britain, people talk about the countryside. And the countryside is, of course, a human artifact. They talk about fields, hedgerows, little villages with cosy pubs, sheep and cows. So straight away we see that, in fact, Europeans live in nature, not apart from nature, in the way Americans perceive themselves. And although, in fact, the food miles travelled in both Europe and the US are pretty comparable, we still in Europe, and my fellow British citizens even, have a sense of place associated with food. In fact, today for lunch I had polenta. 30 years ago I had for lunch polenta. I remember it distinctly. We have foods that are associated with place and who we are. The French have the concept of terroir, which embodies this. So if we start talking about changes in agricultural systems in Europe, we're actually talking about changing the milieu in which people live. It's very different from changing the industrial process of food production in the United States. Experience with social theory suggests that there are at least 3 views of nature. And I've tried to represent them here by borrowing some iconography from the work of the Canadian ecologist C.S. Holling. And to suggest that these icons very nicely summarize for us 3 quite contrasting ideas about the way nature works. At the bottom right-hand corner, you see what Holling calls nature ephemeral. What he's saying is that nature is like a ball balanced on an upturned bowl, and any slight perturbation causes a catastrophic change of state from which you can't recover. Contrast that with the picture on the left, and you have there the notion of nature benign, a very forgiving nature. The ball is in the bowl, and you can perturb the bowl quite significantly, and it will return to an equilibrium state. And in fact, the concept of equilibrium is a very important one, both in the history of science and even more so, I would argue, today in economics. The notion of nature ephemeral, with the ball on the cup, is exemplified by, for example, concern about melting glaciers at the moment and the state of the cryosphere. Nature benign, you can find justification for that as well. Some of you may recall a couple of decades ago a massive oil spill in Alaska, a ship called the Exxon Valdez, which polluted Prince William Sound, and ecologists said it will take a couple of centuries to recover. And indeed, the bay recovered in a couple of decades, much to everybody's surprise. So there's evidence for both these kinds of views. There's a third view, which Holling calls nature perverse tolerant, which suggests that the ball is located in a depression in a landscape. You can perturb it somewhat, but not infinitely. If you perturb it too much, then you will indeed get a change of state. Now, one of the interesting things about this set of views is, of course, if you're George Bush, you know how nature is. Nature's benign. It's forgiving. If you're Al Gore, you know how nature is. It's ephemeral. It's in danger. If you're the US Environmental Protection Agency, nature's perverse tolerant. Because these are the poor people who have to figure out how deep is that depression and exactly where is that ball on the landscape. So this is where you have a very strong need for research. Now, it's very interesting to contrast these with myths of the economy. Did you notice what happened there? I'll just go back so you can see this again, okay? What happens there is that the view of the economy as perverse tolerant, held by probably government bureaucracies and others, remains quite consistent. But the myths of the economy for George Bush and Al Gore actually flip into reverse. George Bush was convinced that even modest policy measures on climate change would cause severe damage to the US economy. And he said the US way of life is not up for negotiation. Al Gore, by the way, runs an investment company with a man called David Blood. They didn't call it Blood and Gore, although they probably should have done. It has a much more mundane name than that, but they run an investment company. And Al Gore is convinced that, in fact, not only are environmental protection policies low cost, they actually bring economic benefits. So there may be a little disruption as you have transitions, but the system returns to an equilibrium state in a beneficial way. I'm just going to briefly show you 3 texts that exemplify these combinations of views of the economy and of nature. These texts come from a UN agency, a non-governmental organization, and from a business organization, and they're all addressing climate change. So this is, I won't read it, I'll let you read it for yourselves, and my apologies to those of you if you struggle with reading the English. But basically what this represents is a hierarchical worldview. The problem as conceptualized by the authors of this piece of text is that we have weak institutional frameworks for both monitoring ecosystems and for organizing responses. And therefore they see that what we need to do is to put in place the monitoring arrangements to see where the ball is on that landscape, and the formal governmental arrangements in order to ensure that what we learn is carried through into policy in a rational and directed manner. And if we find the prospect of constructing these institutions daunting, they reassure us Rome wasn't built in a day. Contrast that with this view, and this is a quote from a representative of the Association of Small Island States at one of the conferences of the party to the Climate Convention. And here I think we see a very different worldview. It's a highly egalitarian one, extending human rights to an anthropomorphized nature. In fact, to the extent that this quotation actually reminds me of the Disney Little Mermaid movie that some of you may have seen, with all the little happy crabs singing, only in this case the polyps are complaining. It implies an urgent need for social justice and inextricably links social justice to good behaviour regarding the environment. And then the third example is this one here, which comes from a financial economist working for a business association. And we see that this view from business economics reflects concern mostly about government intervention with climate policies that could distort the marketplace. And the default assumption here